Basically, what I would like to talk to you about is currency being made accessible for people with disabilities, in particular with visual impairment. And notice that I made a title, The Challenges of Making Currency Accessible. And so I'm not going to tell you the real thing today, because there's so many ways, so many approaches, and so many of those are great. Okay, but I think there's a lot to think about. And now, why is a coin collector here talking to you about currency? The way it came about is that I started noticing that many coins, both circulating and commemorative, have Braille on them. And as I started researching the topic, I just became interested in making currency accessible for visually impaired people. And so basically, I started researching the topic and came up with a bunch of things that I don't think really have been talked about. In addition, I have traveled the world, and I think I have personally used some 25 different currencies in my daily life. And I had a few ideas on what works and what doesn't. So this is what I would like to share with you today. Now first, let's talk about what is accessible currency. Currency can be made accessible for people who can't read it, who can't feel it, or can't see it. Now, it might be interesting, why is currency, why can't you read a currency if you can't see? Well, sometimes it has linguistic or language barriers. For example, when you travel to a country, if you can't understand what's on your currency, then unless it has numbers that you can read and process, it is not going to be meaningful to you. And how about feeling? Well, if you have diabetes, for example, and you also have a visual impairment, you can put tactile features on the currency, but if you can't feel it, there's not much you can do with it. Okay, so we'll talk more about tactile features later. So why is it important that we have accessible currency? Because it's just the right thing to do. We have the right to be independent, so that I don't have to run to you all the time and ask you, oh, can you please tell me, what is it? Is it the 1 or is it the 5? I'm sure it would help me, but I already have to ask for way too many favors anyway. The other reason is because it increases the certainty that I can make proper payment even if there's nobody to help me. And I get this question many times, that don't people give you the wrong amount back? I have paid with currency thousands of times. It only happened to me once. And I thought I was getting back 1,000 forint, and it was a 200. And the next place I went to pay with what I thought was 1,000, and I made a fool of myself. That was 20 years ago, and since then I always investigate before I make claims. So what is the history of accessible currency? Interestingly, the first accessible currency was in China in the 1300s, where the 200 yuan notes had the drawing of 20 coins on it, 20 smaller coins, so that even those people who didn't know what that particular note was worth, they could count the number of coins on it that they were familiar with. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a picture of that. Now, the next, jumping forward until 1971, and the next currency that was made accessible was in the Netherlands, the 10 guilder. Here, I would like to tell you that I brought a bunch of things for you to look at, but also to feel. I would recommend that you touch those currencies after the presentation is done, so you can better relate to it. And there's no rules. This is a time when you're actually encouraged to handle a collection, pull it out, play with, touch it, no problems. I can replace everything that I brought here. Okay? The only thing I didn't bring, and I'm sorry about that, it took me a year to get an uncirculated 10 guilder. And then later on, lots of trial and error. And the different countries try different things on how to make currency accessible for disabled people. And I think today we are still trying, but now we know a lot. So if currency is not necessarily accessible, that there's always the fallback. You can fold your money differently. I leave the 1 unfolded. I fold the 5 lengthwise. I fold the 10 widthwise. I fold the 20 twice, fold the 50 4 times, and give the 100 to my wife. And that is a foolproof way of handling money, but that requires that somebody tells me what's what, if I don't know what it is. So there is another way. I can electronically recognize money if I have the tools, either hardware or software. So I brought this little thing that you'll see in this folder. It's called the iBill. I can just place the money in there. Maybe. Maybe I put it in the wrong way. That's what happens when you demo something. It should have said it's a 1. So it said it's a 1. Okay, so that's a device, and if you actually know what you're doing, you can do it much faster. But there is a problem here that it kind of takes a while, especially when you're standing at the counter, to figure out what kind of money you're especially getting back, because going to the counter, you can do your homework at home and separate the money. There's also phone applications that you can use. You turn the application on, hold the camera over it, and it will tell you what it is, and it can recognize different types of currencies. When it comes to hardware recognizers, my understanding is that only the US and Canada use any kind of a hardware. Now, this is absolutely free of charge for people with reading disabilities in the United States. And now, interestingly, there is this big deal. They changed the currency of India recently, which became even less usable for blind people than what it was before. So the Indian National Bank is planning to create a phone application so that blind people can run it on their phone and recognize their money. Here's the problem. So many people in India can't afford a phone, let alone they don't even have internet. So that is not necessarily helpful. There was another concept that you can find in a few banknotes, but not on circulating ones as far as I know, is QR codes. So that way you don't necessarily have to do anything too special to make currency available. You just put a QR code. Any phone reader any phone can have a QR code app installed, and then you will be able to tell what your currency is. It has lots of pros and cons, so I think there is a reason why that it hasn't been implemented yet. The other thing, the color and contrast. That's, if you can see at least some, that's a great way of differentiating money. On the picture, you can see a Canadian $5, and we'll see that note later on. But the Canadian notes have different colors. The contrast is really great between the numeral and the background. The numeral is relatively large, so people with different kinds of visual needs can easily recognize the notes by vision. The other way of recognizing currency is by size. You might wonder, what on earth is on this picture? It's just a pile of notes. You'll see that the bottom left corners are aligned. And because of that, you can see on the top right corners how each corner is at a different place. So all of those notes are slightly differently sized. they are actually from India. I think not the very most recent notes, but the series before that. When I was in India, I had such a hard time recognizing those currencies because the size difference is just too small. It's a great idea, but it's not sufficient. I can tell if I have two notes whether it's a 10 or a 50, but when I have too many notes, and I don't know which one of the series is missing, it's kind of harder to tell, okay, now which is this? Is this the 10 or a 20? Because just by holding one individually, it's harder to tell. That's why in India they designed a card that you can also see on the slide. What that card does is you take a note, fold it in the middle, fold it around the card, and the card has different ridges. So based on how far the note reaches on the card, you know which note we're talking about. Different countries have these note identifiers. I have one from Mauritius, I have one from European Union. So those can be helpful, but it's also kind of slows you down a little bit when you have to quickly make sure you put your correct change away and people are waiting in line behind you.
Slide 9 tactile features. 1 minute 51 seconds. Slide 9 tactile features.
So then we can talk about different tactile features that we can add to notes. Those are definitely going to be helpful for people with severe visual impairment or blindness, as long as they can feel those different features. The problem with the tactile features is that they are not necessarily quick to find. I'll show a few examples what makes it faster, but they also wear out. You leave your money in your pocket, you wash your pants, you'll never know what it is. But it doesn't have to be that bad if the money has been used for a few months. It wears out easily. One way around that is to use polymer notes that is so much more durable, like in Canada or Romania, Australia, and it's easier to put tactile features on those polymer notes. Now, the other thing is Braille. Oftentimes I hear, well, why isn't there Braille on US currency? I can give you one answer. Because 90% of blind people in the United States can't read Braille. There's other reasons. One of them being is that Braille gets a little more complicated, and it's not like print where you just have to differentiate the 1, the 2, a 5, and a 0 in most cases. But Braille tends to get pretty complex, and let me show you why. So the problem with Braille, what you see there is in the left column you have the numbers. The 1, 2, 5, 10, 20, 50, 100, 10,000, 20,000, okay? Now, in Braille there are two ways of representing a number because there's only a certain dots that you can work with. So we use the letter A for the number 1, but we'll put something that we call the number sign in front of it. So the number 1 is going to be at least 4 dots. Now, obviously, when we're talking about currency, you know these are not going to be letters, these are going to be numerals, okay? So no worries, we don't have to worry about the number sign. But look at the bottom middle column where it says 20,000. That has, 14 dots. If 1 dot is taken away at the beginning, that will mean 10,000. Okay? So not only that I have to count all those zeros, but I really need to make sure I know what that thing is, because I might get the wrong thing back. What happens if I get 20,000 back and somebody tells me it's 10 or it's just worn, right? So is it really a 10 or is it really a 20,000? So it gets really, really problematic, and that really holds you up in the line. And after a while, when the note is worn, if you can't tell what the currency is with absolute certainty, that concept is practically useless.
Slide 13 dash lines, dots, and shapes.
Okay, lines, dots, and shapes. Interestingly, the 10 guilder from the Netherlands that I was showing you was using shapes. I think those are easier to feel than just lines. Dots are pretty difficult to find on a currency, and when you see dots on a currency, it's not necessarily Braille, even though the idea came from the use of Braille. But in reality, when currencies use dots, and I'll show you an example a bit later, when currencies use dots, you just have to count the number of dots.
Slide 14 dash please, a tactile mark.
So, okay, when you have lines or dots, where do you put the mark? You'll see a bunch of currencies in a few minutes where they put it in the corner. Now, how many corners do you have to feel to find those marks? 8. Well, because on which side is it? Right? It takes an awful lot of time to touch all 8 corners on both sides to figure out where the lines are, and now you have to count the lines, and you're only hoping that all the lines are touchable or tactile or still not worn out. So that can be pretty problematic. What kind of shapes are we working with? How similar are they? So while we're getting somewhere with these tactile marks, it really takes some very careful consideration of where you're going to put these marks.
Slide 15 dash Malawi.
So now I'm going to show you a few examples, and you're welcome to grab my folder and flip through those, and almost everything that I'm showing you here are going to be in that folder. So Malawi started with 20 kwacha. It has 1 dot on the middle of the short side. Now, once I know that, it's great because I only have to check, essentially, like slide my fingers down 4 edges, both sides and both ends. I don't need to worry about the corners or the long ends. But on the 20, you have 1 dot. That wears out real quick. It's not polymer. On the 50, you have 2 dots. Now, here comes a curveball. On the 100, you're going to have 3 dots, but in like a triangle shape and on the corner and not in the middle of the edge. So basically, when you handle a kwacha from Malawi, you really need to look in the middle of the short side and on the corners and figure all the corners just to be sure that you know which currency you're handling. Now, obviously, when it's a brand new crisp currency that you see on the pictures, there's other ways of trying to figure out what's what. But when it's worn out, not necessarily. And then on the 200 kwacha, you have another shape of 4 dots in a different pattern again, but also in the corner. So that takes a long time to figure out what you're handling.
Slide 16 dash Australia.
Australia. I love the Australian notes. They are operating with dots. It's kind of easy to slide your hand across the dot and not feel it. But the upside is that it's polymer, so whatever they put on it is going to last for a while. And they put the dots on the long side of the note and on both sides. So really, you just hold the note, slide your hand down on the long edge, and it doesn't matter which edge you're touching, you'll feel the dot, and you can count the dots depending on which note you're holding, and you quickly know what it is. It's relatively quick to recognize.
Slide 17 dash Brazil.
Brazil. Now they have an interesting concept. They put lines in the corners, so again, now you have to figure out which corner out of the 8. But they are using long lines. They use, instead of counting much of the lines, they use horizontal, vertical, and diagonal lines. And plus they use, on the 100, they use like a square shape thingy. So the reality is that when you touch it, you immediately know what it is, because you don't have to count. Once you find it, you know. Now, the only thing is that you kind of stroke the lines differently, not from top to bottom, but from side to side. That's how you can easily count if it's 1 or 2. But here's the problem. I spent 3 weeks in Brazil, and I had no idea they had tactile marks on their notes. Because everything is so worn that you're handling. Somebody called my attention to it who was working in a bank and handed me those notes that you can see on the pictures, because in circulation, you practically just don't have it. So what you see there in the 2 real, I have 2 of those. I'm showing you a crisp, almost uncirculated, and just slid under it, I'm showing you another worn where you can see the marks, the tactile marks, but you actually can't feel it. I encourage you to pay attention to it when you hold those notes. Hungary, where I am from. They were one of the first countries where they put Braille on currency, and I think they applied some painting on it after that. I don't know what was the structure, but it was a disaster, and even on brand new notes, you couldn't tell what's what. And other than that, they are just using the number of lines. The higher, the more valuable the note is, the more lines it has. So I have the 1 and 2 and 3. These are crisp. I have to tell you again, same thing when they are even just slightly worn. You don't know what it is. All right. So I could go on and on and on and on and show you. I think up to date I have discovered that at least 35 currencies around the world has tactile marks. But I just wanted to show you an example of each. So now after all this, is there a perfect example? And again, notice the question mark. I'm not going to tell you what's good and what's not good. All I can tell you that the Canadian dollar has incorporated probably the most ways of making their currency accessible. Instead of using shapes or dots or lines, they use groups of 6 dots. So even if the sum of the 6 will start wearing out and you can only feel 3 or 4 out of that group, notice that on the $10, the 2 groups are so far apart that you're not going to wonder, is it one group or 2 groups, because they are set aside far enough that you immediately know what those dots belong to. They have good contrast. They use different colors. They have large numerals. And all in all, I'm finding throughout my travels, and I don't want to make claims for anybody with any disabilities, but in my travels, I found that I was most efficient recognizing Canadian currency. And let me show you another example. Another good example. It's just my recent favorite. This is a lovely note. The Costa Rican 1000 cologne. And notice the similarity in features, at least to the Canadian dollar, that it's also a polymer note. And they are also using a group of dots. I think it's a bit harder to find because they are not using a group of 6. They're using a group of 3, which is more like a line, but it's still relatively easy to recognize. And they have a huge numeral. And when you will touch that note, you'll feel that you can actually feel that 1000 on the note. Okay, any questions, any thoughts?
Yes. This is fascinating, what you're doing. But one thing that's coming right behind this is that if we standardize this, let's say, then you've got to put on the country so that probably the country. Otherwise, you're going to have to put on peso for Mexico as opposed to dollar for US. But if you put dollar in the Canadian one and dollar in the US one, you don't know. Ultimately, the country's got to go on if this keeps moving. Isn't that true?
You are raising a very, very difficult issue here.
That's what I mean. It's going to be really complicated.
Yes, thank you. That's very important. And the same applies to coins. You see, because when you're handling currency, I think you at least have to assume that you know whose currency you're handling. And when it comes to recognition, we didn't even mention fake or authentic currency. If if you start putting the country on the currency, it's going to raise a bunch of other difficulties, because in which language, or is it in Morse code, or is it in the 2-digit country code, or how do you tell it to people that regardless of language they understand, then they don't have to memorize it. I honestly think that currency will disappear and we'll start using electronic payment before the country will make it on the currency in a form that anybody, regardless of disability, can recognize it. Unfortunately, when it comes to coins, when it comes to notes, you first really need to assume that you understand what is the country whose currency you are handling. Because see, same thing with coins. When I go to a country and I have a handful of coins, and I can pay with that, and then say I'm in Hungary and I'm paying with forints, and then from my previous trip a few euros would slip in, I can easily identify that and separate it. But if you gave me all the currently circulating coins of the whole world, to set them aside country by country, maybe I would make a few mistakes because some of those coins are relatively identical. Now, if you can't see the notes, notes are even more identical. There were suggestions where they said that notes could use different shapes, like you would cut corners off or put holes in it, or put zigzags or scalloped, or you can do so many things, but that brings up a bunch of other issues. For example, how are you going to handle it in vending machines? How durable are they going to be? Are they going to tear much faster? Are they going to wear out so much faster? So I love your idea, and I think it's almost a utopia to implement that.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts, questions?
So are other design elements made accessible, or is it just denomination?
By nature, if you have some vision, then design elements can be made accessible by using good contrast and different colors. But for those people who can't see, no, they are not necessarily made accessible. What you really need to make accessible is the denomination. So anything else that you can make accessible is a gift and a bonus.
I was thinking for identifying the note, you may not be able to read something in dots, but if you had some bigger shapes.
So yes, if you look at the Costa
portrait, you might be able to recognize the person or something like that.
Yes. So when you look at the note from Costa Rica, you can feel that 1000. So there are some shapes, there are some tactile features that you can differentiate in certain countries. So that does work, and if it works for you in your given country, then you can definitely take advantage of it. My experience is that those can only be tactile, again, when the note is fresh and crisp, and when it's a little more worn and folded, then those features fade away pretty quickly.
Do any notes use holes?
Not that I'm aware of.
I'd like to have a round of applause for Tom Babinszki.
Thank you.
Tom, on behalf of the ANA, I would like to present you with this award, which is a certificate of your speech today. It's got your name on it.
Thank you very much.
And also, on behalf of the Chicago Coin Club, I'd like to present you with this medal, also engraved with your name. And thank you for your speech and your presentation today. I can present, if you lean forward a little bit, I'll put it on your neck, and there you go. And you.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Tom Babinszki.